The term governance covers all of your company's policies and procedures that you might have to ensure that your account is kept secure. You don't necessarily want every single employee of your company to have full administrative rights to everything in your Azure account. There are various ways that you can lock down your Azure account so that every person and every application only has access to what they need to have access to. In this video, we'll discuss policies, locks, RBAC, and even some automated recommendations that Azure makes around the security of your account. Next up, another security feature is called Azure Policy. Now, Azure Policy allows you to implement standards for your organization across Azure, okay? And this is a governance technology. So you can basically create rules across specific resource groups or across all of your Azure subscription that basically says these are the rules that we have to follow. Now, those rules can be hard and fast where the resources cannot be created unless they follow a particular rule, or you can just set the standard and have it evaluate the compliance. And you again get a report and say that, 10 out of your 12 virtual machines are compliant and 2 out of your 12 virtual machines are not compliant. And then you can take manual action to ensure compliance. So there's a bunch of built-in policies that you can choose from. There's 60, 70, 80 of them. You can require a specific version of SQL Server 12, which is the latest. You can choose which storage account types are allowed, which storage account types are not allowed, obviously. You can choose which regions that resources can be created in. So if you do not want people creating them outside of Europe, you can say only allow European data centers and that's it. Which virtual machine SKUs, and this is important because some of those virtual machines are quite expensive. And so if you're going to authorize developers, for instance, to create virtual machines, then perhaps you want them to only create the cheaper virtual machines, the developer size virtual machines, and not the 64 CPU mammoth that costs, thousands of dollars per month, okay? You can have tagging requirements. A lot of companies use tagging to help with billing. And so if you said, well, you have to have a billing code, you cannot create a resource unless there's a billing code, then that's a rule that you can put in place, as well as other rules around resource types. So we don't allow Azure SQL Database, any of those accounts. You can just block those resource types. Now, that's just built-in policies. You can create, if you want to get into it, create your own JSON policies that define some really unique things. It's like an if-then type statement, right? Microsoft announced this concept of initiatives, policy initiatives, which are basically groups of policies that are set together and can be then assigned together. So we talked about how tags are often used for billing. So maybe there are 2 tags or 3 tags or 4 tags that need to be present. Instead of having to assign 4 policies for that, and then every resource group also needs the policies, so that could be 4 and 2, it's 8 sets of policies, then you can basically group them together. So in this case, instead of having, 10 policies, you can group them together. You have a single policy initiative. All resources must have these 5 tags, and those are a group of policies that act together. Earlier in this course, we talked about RBAC being an important standard within Azure that Azure uses to control access to resources. So where we had Active Directory being the identity service, RBAC is Microsoft's recommended solution for authorization, which is access control. Typically, you're going to either use lots of the built-in roles, or you're going to be able to create custom roles that represent the common tasks of jobs within your company. So you might have an account department, you might have a sales department, a customer service department, a technical department, and you can create those roles and give very granular access to those people. Okay, so they can only read access to this, they only have write access to that, they can create resources but only in this resource group, etc., etc. You can have very specific access at the role level. And in this way, if your company has 1,000 employees, you do not need 1,000 different profiles for security. You'll maybe only need 20. Okay, so you can then assign the employees to the roles. So you give really granular permissions to those roles, and then those people inherit those roles. And so the people that work in the account department get the account role, people that work in the sales department get the sales role, people who are customer service agents get the customer service agent role. Now, people can have multiple roles. Okay, so you might have a person who is the senior supervisor of the CSRs who also needs not only the CSR role, but there's also a manager role that allows them to see reports and have the ability to edit and update things that CSRs don't have the ability to do. And so people can have more than one role, but you do not want to get in the business of giving Sally in accounting very specific permissions, because when Sally leaves and then Bob joins, you're going to have to, oh man, what permissions do we give to Bob? And it becomes a bit of a mess, right? And maybe you give people too many permissions accidentally, etc. So you assign it to the role. It's easier to manage and review those every few months to make sure they're still required. If somebody needs permissions to something, let's say a person in the account department says, no, I need update permissions in this particular case. You can make that decision to say, oh, let's give it to him temporarily and then remove it, or let's update the role so that anyone with this role can have this permission, right? So those are the decisions that can happen with role-based access control. Now, I mentioned there are a bunch of built-in roles. The most common 3 roles are reader, contributor, and owner. Now, a reader role, when you assign a user a reader role to a particular resource, that means that they only have read access to that. So they cannot make any changes to it. They cannot modify the resource. They cannot delete the resource. All they can do is interact with the resource without changing it. A contributor role is basically allows them to create resources, update resources, modify resources, etc. So that is more of a read-write role. The owner role is basically the contributor role, but the owner can assign permissions to other people. So somebody who's a contributor cannot make another person a contributor, but somebody who's an owner can make another person a contributor. Okay, so owner is basically gives you authority to give permissions to people. Those are the 3 basic rules. Now, there are literally dozens and dozens of rules for each resource type. There's storage reader, storage contributor, storage owner, Azure Active Directory reader, Azure Active Directory contributor, etc. So every technology has its own set of roles, etc. But overall, you can give someone reader, contributor, owner roles as well. Another important, this is somewhat security, but this is also just protecting your environment from mistakes. Accidents do happen. Things get deleted accidentally or updated accidentally. You can basically use Azure locks to tie down resources to flag and indicate that they shouldn't be changed. So there are 2 locks. One is called a read-only lock. The other is called a cannot delete lock. And so within the Azure Active Directory interface, within the portal or within PowerShell, you can go to a resource. In this case, I've got a virtual machine called OpenVPN VM, and I can create a lock that says do not delete. And I can basically say this is a production resource. I do not want anyone to delete it. And the effect that has is the next time someone tries to delete this resource, they're going to get an error. Azure is going to say unable to delete because there's a lock. And then you're left with the situation of having to delete the lock first before you delete the resource. And so if you really do want to delete something, it's a 2-step process. But the lock is there so that you're not accidentally deleting production resources when you have a development server that you've been intending to delete, okay? The other cool thing, because of RBAC, is that you can restrict who has access to the locks. So there's a lock policy. And so you can say, well, I don't mind that you delete resources, but I don't want you to delete locks. And so if a resource is locked, even a person who has access to deleting resources cannot delete it because the locks are in place. Okay, this is another way of locking down your resources, giving people permissions to do things, but then you can also restrict them for certain things. So Azure Advisor is a feature of the portal, again, recently introduced, very cool feature that makes recommendations to you. It runs every few hours and analyzes your account and looks at your account for ways of you can improve it. There is a security tab, and so if you go into the security tab of your Azure Advisor, you're going to see a bunch of security warnings. Now, there's a relationship here between the Azure Advisor security tab and the Azure Security Center recommendations. You can see it still says enable network security groups on subnets. And so even though it's a security recommendation, it appears in two places. So it's up to your preference. If you want to go into Azure Advisor, make sure your account's running at the best capacity, optimal capacity, performance, and cost and wise. You'll see your security warnings there as well, or you can go into the Security Center and see them specifically as well. So if I click on one of this recommendation, one of them, it says to use secure transfer to your storage accounts. And so there's an explanation. So it tells you the reason for enabling HTTPS only is it enforces authentication and encryption between the server and the service consuming it. It has general information, the threats that would happen if you don't enable that, and some instructions on how to fix it. So there's some details in there. Scrolling down a little bit, I can see which resources have been identified as not having HTTPS enabled. And so these are my 4 storage accounts. None of them have it. So I can go into them one by one and turn on HTTPS, and that would remediate this security warning. Now, within the last year, Microsoft has added a new feature for subscriptions that is called Azure Blueprints. Now, the purpose of Azure Blueprints is that you can create a subscription template that has some roles, some policies, some predefined elements to it, and then you can use that template to create other subscriptions. So let's say you work in an organization that is going to end up having dozens and dozens of subscriptions, and instead of creating them manually and then having to add users and policies to each of them one by one, you can create a subscription by a template, and this is called Azure Blueprints.